These are the 8 richest families that own Michigan, and what they control is genuinely wild. We're talking about a family that owns 2% of Ford Motor Company and can never be outvoted. A family worth $22 billion who bought most of downtown Detroit while nobody was looking, and at number 1, a family that privately owns the busiest border crossing in North America. Let's get into it. Number 8. The Ford family. Let's kick things off with the name that is stamped onto this entire state. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, and he didn't invent the assembly line, which surprises people. What he did was work out how to put the two together at a scale nobody had imagined. And then he did the thing that actually changed America, which was to double his workers' pay to $5 a day in 1914 so that the men building the cars could afford to buy one. That single decision helped create the American middle class, and it built a company that turned Detroit into the Motor City. But here's the part almost nobody knows, and it's the reason this family is on a list about who owns Michigan rather than who used to. The Ford family today holds only a small slice of Ford Motor Company in pure economic terms, somewhere around 2% of the equity. 2%. On paper, that sounds like a family that got diluted out of its own business generations ago. Except they hold Class B shares, and those shares carry roughly 40% of the voting power of the entire company. Sit with that arithmetic for a second, because it is one of the great pieces of corporate engineering in American history. The family owns almost none of the company economically and controls nearly half the votes at any shareholder meeting, which means that in more than a century, through wars, bankruptcies at rival firms, oil crises, and the near collapse of the entire American auto industry, no outside investor has ever been able to take Ford away from the Fords. Bill Ford Jr. sits as executive chairman today, great-grandson of Henry. And the family's grip on the state goes past the factory floor. Sheila Ford Hamp, Henry's great-granddaughter, owns the Detroit Lions, which means the family that built the city's industry also owns its football team. That's a family that engineered permanent control with a tiny stake. About 150 miles west, 2 men in a basement built something even harder to get away from. Number 7. The DeVos family. In 1959, in a basement in Ada, Michigan, 2 high school friends named Rich DeVos and Jay Van Andel started selling a biodegradable cleaning concentrate. That was it. One product out of a cellar in a town most Americans have never heard of. That product became Amway, and Amway became one of the most successful and most argued about companies in the history of American business, because DeVos and Van Andel weren't really selling soap. They were selling the idea that anybody could build their own sales business, recruit their own people, and take a cut of everything those people sold too. It made both families extraordinarily rich, and it made Grand Rapids into a genuine center of American wealth in a way that has nothing to do with Detroit. The DeVos family fortune sits somewhere in the region of $5 to $6 billion, with the Van Andels holding a few billion of their own, and what they've done with it in West Michigan is genuinely difficult to overstate. Between the two families, they largely funded the rebuilding of downtown Grand Rapids, the DeVos Place Convention Center, the Van Andel Arena, the Van Andel Institute for Medical Research. If you walk through that city, you are walking through their names. They also bought a basketball team, the Orlando Magic, and the family has been deeply woven into national politics for decades, with Betsy DeVos serving as United States Secretary of Education. That political involvement has made them one of the most polarizing families in the state, and depending on which Michigander you ask, you'll get a very different answer about their legacy. But nobody argues about the arithmetic. 2 teenagers, a basement, and a bottle of cleaning fluid, and now half of downtown Grand Rapids carries their surnames. DeVos and Van Andel got rich selling soap door to door. Across the state, another couple was about to get rich selling something considerably more popular. Number 6. The Ilich family. Also in 1959, a former minor league baseball player named Mike Ilich and his wife Marion opened a single pizza place in Garden City, Michigan, and put their entire savings into it. That shop became Little Caesars, which now does over $4 billion a year in sales, and the family behind it is worth around $7.5 billion. But in Detroit, the Ilich name isn't really about pizza, it's about sport. The family owns the Detroit Red Wings, one of the most storied franchises in hockey. They own the Detroit Tigers, held through a family trust. They own the Motor City Casino Hotel. And they've spent years developing an enormous entertainment zone around Little Caesars Arena that they call District Detroit. So on a given night in that city, a family can be collecting money from the hockey game, the baseball game, the arena, the casino, and the pizza people order afterwards. That's not a business. That's a closed loop around an entire city's leisure time. Marian Ilich is the one holding it now. Mike died in 2017, and she has kept full ownership of the pizza chain, the Red Wings, and the casino, running a multi-billion-dollar empire well into her 90s, with their son Chris running the holding company day to day. Speaking of the focus it takes to run an empire well into your 90s, there's a program someone on our team has been curious about called the Billionaire Brain Wave. It's a simple 7-minute audio built around theta brainwave research, the deep focus brain state linked to where big creative ideas come from. You put on headphones once a day, usually with your morning coffee, and that's the whole routine. It's a one-time $39. It comes with bonus guides on money habits and investing basics, and there's a 90-day money-back guarantee, so testing it costs you nothing if it's not for you. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to the man behind the pizza empire, and an act of kindness he kept secret for years. And there's one story about Mike Ilich that I think about a lot. When Rosa Parks, the woman whose refusal to give up a bus seat helped launch the civil rights movement, was living in Detroit and was assaulted in her own home in the 90s, the Ilich family quietly began paying her rent so she could live somewhere safe. They did it for over a decade, and they never told anybody. It only came out publicly after Mike died. The Iliches built an empire out of a single pizza shop. 6 years later and 20 miles away, a race car driver borrowed $75,000 from his dad. Number 5. The Penske family. Roger Penske was a genuinely talented racing driver who was named Sports Illustrated's Driver of the Year in 1961. And then, at 28, he did something almost no successful driver does, which is stop. He got out of the car because he'd worked out that the real money in motorsport was never in driving it. In 1965, he took a $75,000 loan from his father and bought a single Chevrolet dealership in Philadelphia. That one dealership became Penske Corporation, and Roger Penske is now worth around $8.5 billion. The empire runs on the deeply unglamorous business of moving things. Penske Automotive Group is one of the largest car dealership operations on the planet. Penske Truck Leasing is the reason those bright yellow rental trucks are on every American highway. And underneath all of it sits a logistics and transportation network that most people interact with constantly without ever noticing. But he never actually left racing, and this is where it becomes remarkable. Team Penske has won the Indianapolis 500 more times than any other team in the history of the sport by a distance. And then in 2019, he did the thing nobody saw coming. He bought the Indianapolis Motor Speedway itself, along with the entire IndyCar series. Read that again. A man who spent his life trying to win the Indy 500 eventually bought the racetrack and the championship it belongs to. He lives in Birmingham, Michigan. He's in his late 80s. And by every account, he still works the way he did when he had one dealership and a loan from his dad. Penske turned $75,000 borrowed dollars into $8.5 billion. So what does a fortune look like when it starts with a surgeon who was simply annoyed at his own equipment? Number 4. The Stryker family. In 1941, an orthopedic surgeon in Kalamazoo named Homer Stryker got frustrated. He was treating patients with equipment he thought was badly designed, so rather than complain about it, he started building his own. A better cast cutter, a mobile hospital bed, devices that came directly out of standing in an operating room and thinking, there has to be a better way to do this. That's the entire origin of Stryker Corporation, which is now one of the largest medical technology companies in the world. And Forbes has valued the Stryker family fortune at around $15.9 billion, which ties them for the 27th richest family in America. And here's what makes their wealth different from everything else in this video. You have very likely been inside a Stryker product without ever knowing the name. If you or anybody in your family has had a hip replacement, a knee implant, spinal surgery, or simply been wheeled down a corridor on a hospital bed, there's a strong chance a company founded by a Michigan surgeon was involved in that moment. Rhonda Stryker, Homer's granddaughter, is worth over $7 billion on her own and is the only one of her siblings to sit on the company board. And what she did with it is worth knowing, because in 2011 she and her husband gave $100 million to Western Michigan University, where she'd earned her master's degree, to found a medical school. It carries her grandfather's name. So, a surgeon's frustration in 1941 became a $15 billion family fortune, and his granddaughter used it to build a school that trains the next generation of surgeons. The strikers are worth $15.9 billion. There is exactly one other Michigan family sitting on precisely the same number, and they got there selling groceries. Number 3. The Mayer family. In 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, a Dutch immigrant barber named Hendrik Meyer opened a grocery store in Greenville, Michigan, with about $340 of borrowed stock and his 14-year-old son Fred helping him run it. The store had 22 customers on its first day. That family is now worth about $15.9 billion, exactly tied with the strikers as the 27th richest family in America. And the reason why is one idea that they had before anybody else in the world did. In 1962, Meyer opened something they called Thrifty Acres, and it combined a full grocery store with a full general merchandise store under a single roof. Food and clothing and hardware and toys, all in one building, one checkout, one trip. They invented the supercenter. And I want to be precise about the timing here, because 1962 is the same year Sam Walton opened the very first Walmart, and Walmart would not open a supercenter of its own for another 26 years. A family in Greenville, Michigan worked out the future of American retail more than 2 decades before the company that would eventually dominate it. Today, Meyer runs over 250 stores across the Midwest, doing more than $20 billion a year, and it has never gone public. Not once in 90 years. Hank, Doug, and Mark Meyer, the third generation, have kept the whole thing in family hands. And the culture that Fred Meyer built into it is the sort of thing that sounds made up. He was known for wandering his own stores, handing out coupons for free ice cream cones, and for insisting that employees call him Fred rather than Mr. Meyer. When a competitor was struggling, he was known to help them out. A billionaire in his own supermarket, giving away ice cream. The Meyers built their fortune selling things to Michigan. The family at number 2 bought Michigan itself, or at least the part of it nobody else wanted. Number 2. The Gilbert family. Dan Gilbert is worth $22.9 billion, which makes him comfortably the richest person in the state of Michigan, and his wife Jennifer is separately worth over $4 billion. He started with a mortgage company. In 1985, he and his brother Gary founded Rock Financial, sold it to Intuit in 1999 for $532 million, and then, in one of the smartest moves in modern American finance, bought it back 3 years later for a fraction of that. That company became Quicken Loans and then Rocket Mortgage, and it turned into the largest mortgage lender in the United States. But the reason he belongs in a video about who owns Michigan is what he did next. In 2010, Gilbert moved his entire headquarters and thousands of employees from the suburbs into downtown Detroit, at a moment when downtown Detroit was close to the lowest point in its modern history. The city would file the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history 3 years later. Buildings sat empty. Whole blocks were abandoned. And Gilbert started buying them. Through his real estate arm Bedrock, he has acquired something on the order of 100 properties across downtown Detroit, spending billions restoring skyscrapers that had been left to rot for decades, including the Book Tower and the Hudson site, where the city's legendary department store once stood. So there is now a genuine and ongoing argument in Detroit about whether one man privately buying up the core of a major American city is a rescue or a takeover. Supporters point out that nobody else was willing to put a dollar into those buildings when it mattered. Critics point out that a single family now has enormous influence over what a public city becomes, and that longtime residents haven't necessarily seen the benefit. Both of those things can be true at once, which is what makes it interesting. He also survived a serious stroke in 2019 and kept control of the whole operation throughout. Gilbert has more money than anyone else in this video by a distance. But the family at number 1 is worth a fraction of what he is, and they own something he could never buy at any price. Number 1. The Moround family. I want to be upfront with you about something before we start, because it matters. The Moround family is not the richest family on this list. Forbes has put them at around $1.5 billion, which next to Dan Gilbert's $22 billion is not close. They're at number one because of what they own, and there is nothing else like it in North America. The Moround family privately owns the Ambassador Bridge. That's the bridge connecting Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, and for nearly a century it has been the busiest commercial border crossing between the United States and Canada. An enormous share of the trade between two countries, the actual physical goods, moving across a structure owned by one family in Grosse Pointe. And the story of how they got it starts with a genuinely extraordinary coincidence. Manuel Moround, known his whole life as Matty, was born in Detroit in 1927, 2 years before the Ambassador Bridge opened. His grandfather had fled Lebanon before the First World War, gone to South America, and eventually landed in Windsor. And here's the part that sounds invented. The family were living in Windsor when the company constructing the Ambassador Bridge bought their house and demolished it to make way for the project, which is what pushed the family across the river to Detroit in the first place. So the bridge displaced them before it was even finished. Matty grew up cleaning ashtrays in his father's gas station, built a trucking business, and then in 1979, he did something nobody expected. He bought the Ambassador Bridge by quietly acquiring its shares on the New York Stock Exchange. A trucking man from Detroit bought an international border crossing off the open market. When Matty died in 2020, control passed to his son Matthew, who runs it today through the Detroit International Bridge Company on the American side and the Canadian Transit Company on the Canadian side, alongside a transportation empire including Central Transport, Crown Enterprises, and stakes in publicly traded logistics firms. Now, understand what owning that bridge actually means. Passenger cars pay around $10 US to cross. Commercial trucks pay roughly $15 to $20 per axle each way, and a standard tractor-trailer has 5 axles. That toll booth runs day and night on one of the most heavily trafficked trade routes on Earth, and every cent goes to a private family. Which brings us to the fight that has consumed the last 15 years. Canada decided to build a competing bridge, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $6.4 billion crossing financed by the Canadian government and jointly owned by Canada and the state of Michigan. Public infrastructure directly competing with a private monopoly and with tolls roughly half what the Ambassador charges. Economists at the University of Michigan Flint and Michigan State have estimated the Morounds could lose in the region of $30 million a year once it opens. So the family fought it, and they fought it on a scale that's hard to comprehend. In 2012, they spent over $30 million of their own money campaigning for a Michigan constitutional amendment designed to block the project. Michigan voters rejected it. They pursued it through the courts for years. And then it escalated. According to federal lobbying disclosures reported by the CBC and the Financial Times, the bridge company has paid one Washington lobbying firm more than $3 million since 2018, including $250,000 starting in August of 2025, specifically on issues relating to international bridges. Campaign finance records show Matthew Moround donated $250,000 to the Republican National Committee in July of 2025, and a further $1 million to a political action committee supporting the president in January of 2026. Then, in February of 2026, the New York Times reported that Moround met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Within hours of that meeting, the president publicly threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge. A congressional committee sent Moround a formal letter requesting all communications relating to that meeting. And in June of 2026, one day before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the opening of the bridge was postponed. I'm giving you that as documented reporting rather than as an opinion, because you can draw your own conclusions. But here's the fact that puts this family at number 1 on a list about who owns Michigan. Every other family in this video owns a company. The Morounds own the ground that trade between two nations physically has to cross, and when two national governments spent $6.4 billion trying to build an alternative, one family in Grosse Pointe was able to make the opening of it a live international question. And those were the 8 richest families that own Michigan. Notice the pattern running through nearly all of them, though. A barber with $340 of stock, a surgeon annoyed at his own equipment, 2 teenagers in a basement with a bottle of cleaner, a driver who borrowed $75,000 from his father. Almost none of this money was inherited from somewhere else. It got built here, out of the state itself. And then every one of them did the same thing with it, which was to buy something permanent. A voting structure, a stadium, a city block, a bridge. So which one surprised you the most? The family that owns 2% of Ford and can never be outvoted. The grocers who invented the supercenter 26 years before Walmart. Or the family that quietly bought an international border crossing off the stock market. Drop it in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to Global Status, because we break down empires like this every single week.